do. We are getting on with it. We've got a plan. We are delivering. Thank you.
Madam Chair.
Matt Ducey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a privilege to rise on behalf of the National Party to oppose the Prime Minister's statement and to support the Leader of the Opposition's amendment that this House has no confidence in the Labour-led government because in just 2 short years it has plunged New Zealand into deficit and failed to deliver on any of its promises. And I must say, how good was Simon Bridges in his speech for the Prime Minister's statement? How good was Simon Bridges? Because the reality is, with this government littered with failures over the last 2 years, a failed socialist experiment is what this government's been. Kiwi Build, the Primary Growth Fund, fees free, have delivered no housing, has got no new tertiary students in, and has been wandering around the country giving out money purely for votes. This government has been a failed socialist experiment. And being a proud Canterbury MP, I remember a time when Canterbury rebuild was a top priority for a government. The last National government made it one of its top 4 priorities. And we had John Key, the Prime Minister, a Cantabrian. We had Jerry Brownlee leading it with the Greater Christchurch Regeneration Minister. We had the Honourable Amy Adams, the Honourable Nicky Wagner, senior ministers driving from the front bench to make sure the second biggest city in New Zealand that punches well above its weight in GDP rebuilt. And what we have now is one Canterbury minister in the front bench, the Honourable Megan Woods, who's getting rolled. And we know that, don't we? Because in the last infrastructure announcement, Auckland got over $4 billion and Canterbury got $159 million. How is that fair? Billions for Auckland and a few million for Canterbury. Cantabrians are being fleeced and forgotten under this government. No longer a priority. No longer are we a priority in Canterbury. What about Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister's press secretary, who told Chris Lynch we would need another March 15th mosque shooting before the Prime Minister would come back on his talk show? That's where this government is lacking. It's failing New Zealand, it's failing Canterbury when Canterbury needs it most. And how much money has this government spent out of its $300 million promised for Canterbury? Not $1. And this week, they rehashed their announcement for the stadium. That was announced 2.5 years ago. What has this government done in the last 2.5 years? Sat on the $300 million, dangled it as a carrot, and we've had the stadium stall, the Metro Sports facility. You can't even get a car park for the hospital off the ground. And what you have is people having to park miles away from the hospital and take shared transport with wheelchairs and crutches, sick people, because what you promised you haven't delivered. This government has not delivered. In 2.5 years, a failed socialist government. And I tell you what it's causing in the regions and in my area of Waimakariri. And the 9th of February, one of the first protest rallies Waimakariri has ever seen. 400 people turned out at Owen Stalker Park in Wood End. That might not sound like a lot of money for you guys from the big metropolitan cities, but for a small town where there's only a few thousand people, 400 is a lot. Turning out on Waitangi weekend. Why? Because the government failed to commit to the Wood End bypass. Why was the Wood End bypass being taken off the table? Because under the GPS for transport, this government stripped out $5.5 billion of state highway funding and redirected it to public transport initiatives in Auckland that haven't even eventuated. So why are people in Christchurch and Greater Christchurch and Canterbury suffering? Because you're redirecting state highway funding to Auckland. This town has a motorway running through the centre. It has 20% increase in vehicle movements in the last 2 years because of the growth in that area. It's now topping 20,000 car movements a day going through that state highway that goes straight through a town. Parents take their primary school kids across that motorway every day to school. And we wanted pedestrian eyes and lights. And do you know what NZTA said? They come in and said, well, that's good, but you're going to have to apply to an oversubscribed budget. That's NZTA coming in and telling us the Woodend bypass is now off the table, there's no money. We're even having to beg for safety improvements. We have got a motorway of 20,000 cars and trucks going through the centre of a small rural town. And you've got elderly telling me they don't even go to their medical appointments anymore because they don't want to cross the road to get the public bus. Local businesses are saying that people are not stopping anymore to go to their shops because they don't want to get back into the traffic. That is what's playing out in regional New Zealand. You have failed regional New Zealand, and this is why you can say what you want in the Beltway of Wellington, but it's your policies under the Prime Minister's statements that's failing Canterbury. And that's why people are turning out and protesting, that you're not listening. And you know what the real kick in the guts is? That Woodend resident group have joined up the Make State Highway 1 Safer Committee. It's made up of the primary school principal, the head of the Woodend Residents Association, the head of the Pegasus Residents Association, the community board chair, the Lions president. They wrote to your Transport Minister, Phil Twyford, asking, they didn't say, look, we want you to guarantee it in one meeting. They wanted to come up here at their own expense and just tell them what they're encountering in that town. And your Transport Minister refused to meet them, won't even meet them. That's where you are failing. This government has failed in the last 2.5 years, Madam Speaker. And I just want to finish in what should have been a success for this government, mental health. You championed mental health. You told New Zealanders you would make a difference. And that's a problem with the Labour government. They tell people in election time, all you need to do is vote us in. We will make a difference. Well, for $1.9 billion, do you know what? Under the annual reviews we've just been through for the DHBs. Manaake. Yes, what a great program for Canterbury. We have 16 regions in New Zealand. You've rolled it out to one. At this rate, it's going to take you 48 years. Picky Pilot for 24-year-olds. You've rolled it out to Wellington. 1.9 billion for mental health. And do you know what? After the annual reviews we've just received at the Health Select Committee, child and adolescent wait times in the DHBs have gone up 40% in the last 2 years. People in the DHBs are saying they haven't seen any of the money. It hasn't flowed down yet. They don't know where it is. So stand up and say how much of the 1.9 billion you have spent to date. And under your own inquiry that said we needed to move access from 7 to 20%, how much access have you improved? Because your own minister won't answer that question. How much access has been increased in the last 2.5 years? Mental health was supposed to be a strong point for you, and now you are failing to deliver on mental health. Mental health will be categorised as another Kiwi Bill, another fees-free, and another primary growth fund failure. And I find that difficult because you raised expectations. You told people in the last election you were going to make mental health a key plank. Yes, you've got this figure of 1.9 billion, but in the last 2 years under your government, the wait time for child and adolescent family services has increased 40%.
Madam Speaker.
Can I just remind the speakers again not to bring the Speaker into the debate? This is a split call, I understand. Kiri Tapu Allen.